Welcome to Whispers in the Dark, where we explore the darkest mysteries and true crime cases that have left a mark on our society. In today's episode, we dive deep into the chilling and controversial case of Lucille Duncan, a woman whose story of alleged abuse, familial loyalty, and murder shocked the nation. Lucille Duncan was convicted of murdering her ex-boyfriend, James Pruitt, in a case filled with twists and turns, including a brother who took responsibility for the killing and a son who was forced to testify against his mother. The case captivated true crime enthusiasts and remains a topic of debate. Today, we'll explore the events leading up to James Pruitt's tragic death, the trial, Lucille's conviction, and the recent developments in the case as her fight for justice continues behind bars. But before we begin, if you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into some of the most mysterious and perplexing cases. And if you find today's episode insightful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's dive into the case of Lucille Duncan. Born in 1966 in Boone County, Missouri, Lucille Duncan was the youngest of three siblings in a working-class family. Raised in a tight-knit, but often tumultuous household, Lucille's childhood was anything but simple. Her mother, Joan Duncan, was a devout woman who maintained a strict and religious home. Lucille's father, however, was described as distant and often absent. He worked long hours as a mechanic, leaving Joan to raise the children alone for most of their lives. Lucille's siblings, Gerald Duncan and Eleanor Duncan, were both several years older than her, leaving Lucille to grow up with a feeling of isolation even within her family. Her brother, Gerald, became somewhat of a protector early on, looking out for his younger sister in ways their father never did. This would be a significant dynamic throughout Lucille's life. As a teenager, Lucille was known to be quiet but troubled. She struggled academically and had few close friends. While her mother hoped that Lucille would follow the church's teachings, Lucille rebelled, often sneaking out at night to attend parties and experiment with drugs. By the age of 17, she had already begun a downward spiral, dabbling in narcotics and forming relationships with the wrong crowd. Lucille's life after high school was marked by addiction and instability. In the late 1980s, she became addicted to methamphetamines, and her habit quickly spiraled out of control. She moved from one abusive relationship to another, always seeking solace in drugs to escape her reality. Despite her mother's attempts to intervene and send her to rehab, Lucille never quite managed to stay clean for long. By her mid-20s, Lucille had two children from two different fathers, neither of whom remained in her life. Her oldest child, Jeremiah Robertson, would later become a key figure in her murder trial. Lucille tried to raise Jeremiah and his younger sister, but her addiction and the chaos of her life made it difficult to provide any stability. Both children spent much of their early years being shuffled between family members and foster care, another factor that would impact their lives later on. Despite her chaotic existence, those close to Lucille described her as a caring and loving mother when she was sober. Her family and friends often recalled how, even during her darkest moments, she tried to protect her children from the realities of her troubled relationships. James Pruitt, born in 1958, was raised in Columbia, Missouri, in what many considered a typical, middle-class family. His parents, Edward and John Pruitt, were described as hardworking and devout members of their local church. James was the eldest of three children and, by all accounts, had a relatively normal upbringing. In school, James was well-liked and known for his quick wit, humor, and athletic abilities. As a young man, James worked in construction, where he earned a reputation as a skilled laborer. However, despite his charm and hard-working demeanor, James had a dark side. By his early 20s, he was already struggling with substance abuse, particularly alcohol and cocaine. His addiction cost him several jobs and strained relationships with his family. James's personal life was equally turbulent. He had been married twice, with both marriages ending in bitter divorces due to his addiction and violent outbursts. His first wife, Deborah, claimed that James had a pattern of becoming aggressive when under the influence. She filed a restraining order against him, and he allegedly threatened her with a knife during a domestic dispute. His second wife, Angela, echoed similar stories, stating that James was a charming man when sober. Angela eventually collided. They were introduced by a mutual friend at a bar in Boone County. Lucille, in her mid-30s, was struggling to rebuild her life after years of addiction and toxic relationships, while James was deep in the throes of his own addiction. At first, Lucille was drawn to James's charm. He was charismatic, funny, and seemed like the kind of man who could provide stability at least on the surface. James, on the other hand, was captivated by Lucille's resilience and her ability to understand the darker aspects of his life. Both had survived abusive relationships and shared a mutual understanding of pain, though neither realized just how destructive their relationship would become. Within a few months, Lucille and James were living together, but their relationship quickly deteriorated as their addictions took hold. Both were struggling to stay sober, and their time together became increasingly violent and toxic. Lucille would later claim that James frequently physically abused her, often becoming violent when he couldn't obtain drugs. In her police statements, she described multiple incidents where James beat her, strangled her, and threatened to kill her and her children. James's family, however, painted a different picture. They described Lucille as controlling and manipulative, insisting that she had escalated many of their fights. In their eyes, James was a victim of her manipulation, and Lucille was using his addiction to control him. By the time July 2003 rolled around, the relationship between Lucille and James had become a nightmare. Both were battling addiction, and their arguments were growing more violent by the day. Lucille's friends and family members, including her brother Gerald, noticed her growing fear of James. She had filed multiple police reports against him, accusing him of assault, and a court date was set for James to face charges for his abuse against Lucille. James, however, was not ready to let Lucille go. He continued to call and harass her, sometimes threatening her life, her children, and her family. According to Lucille, James had even suggested they die together in a murder-suicide, a claim that would later be brought up during the trial. Lucille's brother, Gerald, who had always been protective of her, had become increasingly concerned for her safety. Gerald, a former Marine with his own troubled past, warned Lucille that James was dangerous and that she needed to leave him before it was too late. But Lucille, torn between her fear of James and her complicated feelings for him, felt trapped. On July 4, 2003, the situation escalated. Lucille had filed charges against James for a previous assault, and he was scheduled to be sentenced in just a few days. However, before that could happen, Lucille and James met one last time. According to Lucille, James wanted a chance to say goodbye to her and her children. Lucille, feeling that James wouldn't hurt her in front of her brother, Gerald, agreed to the meeting. The three of them, Lucille, her 14-year-old son Jeremiah, and Gerald, met James Pruitt that night. What transpired during that encounter would be hotly debated in courtrooms for years to come. Lucille, Gerald, and Jeremiah all gave similar accounts of the evening, which would be corroborated during the trial. They claimed that James became agitated and began threatening their family. It was in this moment, Lucille Duncan claimed, that he snapped. While driving home, James continued to threaten their lives. Gerald, a former Marine, told police that when he heard James say, "I'm going to get your family," he made a split-second decision. He pulled out a gun and shot James Pruitt in the back of the head. James Pruitt's body was found the next morning in the woods near Boone County, Missouri. His killer had dumped him there and discarded a bag of bloody clothes, which was later found by a passing motorist. After the body was discovered, Lucille was brought in for questioning. She admitted to being with James the night of his death, but denied any knowledge of how he died. Her son, Jeremiah Robertson, was also questioned, and it wasn't long before he broke under the pressure. At just 14 years old, Jeremiah told police that his uncle, Gerald, had shot James Pruitt. He also claimed that his mother knew what was going to happen that night. It was this confession that would become central to the prosecution's case against Lucille Duncan. Lucille maintained her innocence, stating that she had no idea her brother would kill James. However, prosecutors argued that she had played an active role in luring James to his death. Her son's testimony would become a critical piece of evidence against her. In 2004, Lucille Duncan was put on trial for the murder of James Pruitt. The prosecution painted her as a manipulative woman who had orchestrated the killing to escape her troubled relationship. Her brother, Gerald, had already confessed to pulling the trigger, but the state argued that Lucille was just as guilty. Lucille's defense team fought back, claiming that she was a victim of abuse and that her brother acted to protect her. They pointed to the years of alleged abuse and the threats James had made against her family. But the most damning evidence came from her own son, Jeremiah. Under pressure, Jeremiah testified against his mother, claiming that she had been involved in the murder plot. Lucille would later say that she convinced her son to testify in order to protect him, knowing that he was facing potential jail time for his involvement. Despite the defense's efforts, Lucille Duncan was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gerald Duncan took a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, eligible for parole in 2027. For the past 2 decades, Lucille has maintained her innocence. She has given several interviews from the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri, where she has shared her side of the story. In 2017, Lucille and Gerald appeared on Oxygen Snapped behind bars to discuss the case. Lucille expressed regret over the events that transpired, but insisted that she had no part in the murder. Gerald, too, stood by his confession, stating that he acted alone to protect his sister and her children. In the years since the trial, new questions have emerged about Lucille's conviction. Despite these revelations, Lucille's appeals have been denied, leaving her to continue serving her life sentence. James Pruitt's family remains adamant that justice was served and that Lucille is where she belongs. The case of Lucille Duncan is one filled with tragedy. From the violence and abuse she allegedly endured to the life-altering choices her family made that night in July 2003, Lucille's story continues to unfold as she fights for her freedom, and only time will tell whether new evidence could one day lead to her release. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our future investigations. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you believe in uncovering the truth. No matter how dark it may be, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Whispers in the Dark.